Okay, so we're talking about, as I said, three key concepts that are going to be, that I want you to retain, but also very likely applicable to the analysis of the conspiracy theories and pseudosciences for the sake of the presentation and the final essay. So the three key concepts are, the first key concept is this process of inference to the best explanation. So we observe a phenomenon. How do we formulate, or how do we imagine likely likely explanations for why this event took place? Okay, so we do that all the time. You know, my car doesn't start. Why? What's the likely cause here? Okay, and presumably figuring it out can help you get out of it. So there's a sort of practical value there. I have a flat tire. Why is that the case? Okay, this particular airline disappeared. What possible explanatory possible explanatory theories can be advanced? Okay, it went missing. It crashed somewhere in the ocean. It was part of some larger conspiracy theory. When some famous or some celebrity person disappears, there's a bunch of theories about that. 9/11, was it an inside job? Was it not an inside job? How do we explain the phenomena that we're observing? Okay, a person gets assassinated. Why did they get assassinated? Who did it? What was the motive? We're always seeking to explain the world and the events that we observe. So that would be the first concept that I want you to retain, this idea of inference to the best explanation. Still some people coming in here. The second concept I want you to retain is also one that is likely to be applicable to many of your conspiracy theories and pseudosciences, is this idea of an ad hoc. And ad hoc, we already touched upon it a little bit, just in passing, when I said that a conspiracy very often changes, it shifts sort of goalposts. Okay, you'll shift the goalposts. So when your idea is on the verge of being challenged or on the verge of being disproven, you make something up, you add something to it. You further render you render the theory more complicated, more difficult to disprove. But what you end up making is a sort of a monster at the same time. So that's the second concept that I want you to retain. First concept is inference is the best explanation. The second concept is this ad hoc explanations. These we're basically going to call duct tape. It's a sort of a patchwork. Let me see. Hold on. Okay. Still some people coming in. And the last concept I want you to think about is how do we move from, how do we decide between competing theories? In other words, there's one event, I have a flat tire. What are the multiple explanations that I can think of for why I have a flat tire? And which one do I prefer? Which one am I likely to act upon first? So how do we decide between competing theories or competing explanations? That's basically what we're talking about. So let's get into it. My PowerPoint doesn't like too much. So we naturally have a curiosity. We observe things and we want to understand why those things happened the way they did. And not only that, we're able to then verify whether our explanations or whether ideas make sense. And if we get good at this, there's obviously practical value because we have sort of predictive ability. We're able to observe that this situation happens and this is why it happened. So maybe I'll try to, let's say, avoid that in the future. Okay, I have a flat tire. I have a flat tire because, let's say, I forgot to put the caps back on, or I get a flat tire because the temperature changed, so the air pressure changed. So you acquire the sort of root cause analysis, and that's actually pretty useful because then it gives you sort of a predictive ability. It gives you a sense of expectation. So let me try to put it this way with a sort of a concrete example. We can determine whether something is the case or not. We can determine whether something is true or not. But then there's a subsequent consideration, which is once we have determined or we have decided that something is true, or we assume that it is true, or it's likely to be true, another sort of level of analysis is, well, why is it true? Okay. And then furthermore, how do we go and what are the implications of it being true and why it's true and how can that be of practical value? So let me just give you a concrete example. Suppose you read an article and it says 1 in 3 road accidents happen a mile from home. 1 in 3 road accidents happen a mile from home. Let's suppose that this is true. Let's suppose that this was done well. It's a sort of a good inductive argument. We arrive at this. Okay, this is sort of statistical analysis, and we arrive at this statement: 1 in 3 accidents happen a mile from home. So let's assume that it's true. But now, why is it true? What sort of explanations can we suggest as to why this might be true? Does anybody want to propose a potential explanation? There's at least 2 or 3 that we can think of. Why do you think? What do you think are the likely causes of this? What are the root causes of this increased propensity for accidents around your house? Now we're on Zoom, so everybody's a little bit shy, and nobody's going to participate at the same frequency as they otherwise would have if we were in class. It's one of the disadvantages. Anybody want to propose a potential explanation for why this is the case? Somebody coming up in the chat. So you leave from home every day. You leave from home every day. So I mean, we can be a little bit more specific. Anybody else want to add something to that? Let's unpack that. Okay? You start from home basically every day. So what that means is that you're either spending a lot of time within that 1 mile radius. Most of your trips may actually take place within that 1 mile radius. Actually, a lot of people use their cars now to actually do trips that are within a mile, just even to, let's say, go to the depanneur, go to the grocery store. So there may be many trips that take place within this 1 mile radius. Furthermore, you can add to that even trips that are beyond this 1 mile radius have at least some leg of that trip is within that 1 mile radius. So you're actually spending quite a bit of time driving within this 1 mile radius from home. Okay? Even if you're actually going outside of that radius, there's still a good proportion of that trip that may be done within this radius. And then furthermore, this is a student in another class had mentioned this, and I think that it's a relevant consideration, is that actually to get 1 mile away from home, you usually have to travel more than 1 mile. Okay, unless you live in, let's say, on a busy road where you conveniently can travel straight out, on a straight line 1 mile, and you're outside of home in the direction where you have to be going. Mostly, in order for most of us, I know it's true in my case, to get a mile away from home by car, I actually have to travel more than a mile. So that's one factor. I mean, it's just sort of the statistical probabilistic distribution as a result of how much time you're actually spending in this zone. Anything else that you can add to that? You can also add a sort of a psychological component, which is some people might say that when you're home, you have a sense of familiarity. When you're in your neighborhood, that's right. So as was mentioned on the chat, Sabrina, when you're in your neighborhood, you're maybe less attentive because the place is known to you. So you get this sort of familiarity breeds contempt. There's a sense of familiarity. There's a sense of, there's a sense of comfort, the sense you're already at home. You expect things to be in a certain place. You know that when people are speeding and where they do their stops and where they don't do their stops, and but that actually might catch you off guard. In other words, you assume that everybody's going to do their stop here because everybody knows that there's a stop, because everybody always does their stop at this corner. And on that particular day, you're not as attentive because your expectation sort of lowers your degree of caution, and that might result in accidents. Yeah, so I think that there's a sort of psychological component, that there's a sense of familiarity, there's a sense of maybe comfort, there's a sense that you are obviously, and you can sort of compare this, you would expect that if you are driving in, let's say, a neighborhood which is not familiar to you, you necessarily have to be a little bit more attentive. Whereas when you're home, sort of you are blinded by habits in a way. So these are some potential explanatory factors. Okay, and we can think of a bunch of other explanatory factors that may not be as strong. So some people coming in here. So what? Yeah, go ahead. No. So now what we're looking for is, we're trying to give a theoretical explanation for why something is the way it is. As I said, an airplane goes missing. We want to explain why that is, what was, what occurred, why did it occur? If somebody gets assassinated, we want to know why it occurred. If a pandemic breaks out, we want to know how it happened, where it started, why it got started. We have this natural curiosity. Again, there's actually a practical value to trying to figure out sort of root causes of things, why something is the way it is, why something has happened. So the first key concept that I want you to retain is this idea of inference to the best explanation. Let me give you an example, and then we'll sort of unpack it. Is suppose you wake up in the morning and your car has a flat tire. There may be several potential reasons for why you could suspect your car is having a flat tire. There are several potential explanations that you can propose. Some of them you will judge to be more likely than others. So that's the process of inference to the best explanation. What explanation best accounts for the observed phenomena and all of the available evidence surrounding that phenomena? So I have a flat tire. Suppose I have a flat tire and I see that there is a broken beer bottle right at the entrance of my driveway. The broken beer bottle is situated where my tire would normally go over. I see a piece of glass from the broken beer bottle. I see a piece of glass which matches the broken beer bottle sticking out of my tire, and that particular tire is flat. The idea that the broken beer bottle is therefore the cause of my flat tire seems to make a lot of sense, okay? But let me make this point, is that all of those things can be true because you're dealing with an inductive process. You may be correct in assuming that that is the most reasonable explanation, and yet you still might be wrong. In other words, it might be true that there's a broken beer bottle. It might be true that you went over that broken beer bottle. It might be true that there's a piece of glass sticking out of your tire from that beer bottle. But actually, the reason why your tire is flat is because your neighbor's kids were, up to some mischief last night, and they decided to let the air out of your tires. Okay, I'm not even sure if young kids know how to do that anymore. Okay, but so even if, let's say but there are testable implications there. One testable implication is that if you take that tire to a car mechanic for $20, he's going to take it off, he's going to patch it up and reinflate it. And then you say, okay, there's air. Now the air is sort of contained within the tire. I seem to have fixed the problem. All of those things still might be true. And yet that's not the reason why your tire was deflated to begin with. Okay. In other words, he put a patch on the hole, but it was unnecessary. But now, I mean, we're entering the realm of more and more unlikely. At that point, most people would just be satisfied in saying, I had a flat tire because of the broken beer bottle. And that would be inference of the best explanation. There's a phenomenon. There is some available evidence with regards to this phenomenon. No other explanation seems to account for this particular phenomenon as well and account for the evidence as well. Therefore, I'm willing to bet that my tire is flat as a result of this broken beer bottle. And then, I address it. I take it to the mechanic. I get it patched up, and the problem is resolved. And then I conclude that, yeah, very likely, for all intents and purposes, I was correct. I figured out the root cause of the problem. But now the point is, one point I've already mentioned, which is, the slides want to cooperate here. There's no guarantees. This is always an inductive process. All the evidence may suggest that your initial hypothesis of the broken beer bottle is reasonable, and you might still be wrong. It might be a sort of a weird anomaly situation that you didn't think of. For why your tire is flat. And the point is that even in science, we can think of just in terms of why is my car not starting, or why is my tire flat. If you really want to be creative and imaginative, you can come up with a million different potential explanations as to why my tire is flat, but they're not all equal. Some of those explanations, if you're a reasonable person, you would judge that some of those explanations are better. Okay. In other words, my tire is flat because there's a piece of glass sticking out of it. That's a likely hypothesis. Seemingly a little bit less likely is my tire is flat because my neighbors were up to some mischief last night. And then you can go into ever less probable explanations. My tire is flat because aliens came down last night with their UFO and they let the air out of my tire. My tire is flat because the air inside my tire, and only this specific air that was contained within my tire, decided to spontaneously teleport itself outside of my tire. Now we're entering the realm of sort of fantasy and fiction. Okay. So this is one sort of mode of analysis that you can do, especially with conspiracy theories. You can sort of present, it's not like, okay, this is the theory, here are the reasons for, and here are the reasons against it. You can lay down, let's say, the potential explanations, because there may be more than one potential explanation. Let's say, even if you take something like the JFK assassination, there isn't just one conspiracy theory. There are numerous conspiracy theories. So you can sort of give an analysis for each one and look at which explanation seems to be the most likely. Okay. Let's say if you're doing it on the Bermuda Triangle, you can say, well, one explanation is UFOs. One explanation is these sort of interdimensional portals that just so happen to open up at the Bermuda Triangle. Another explanation are these, what they call hexagonal clouds that create these crazy storms. Another explanation might be these methane bubbles that emerge from the sea. Now, some of these explanations are interesting for some things and not interesting for other things. They account for some bits of evidence and not other bits of evidence. Let's say if you have methane bubbles, massive methane bubbles coming up from the sea, that can help you explain why boats have gone missing. It doesn't really help you explain why airplanes have gone missing. Okay. And then the point, but you might get caught up in all of these fantastic explanations that the best explanation might not necessarily be the most exciting explanation. And the best explanation, you might be so distracted by these sort of sensational explanations that a common sense explanation will sort of, you'll miss it. And sometimes the best explanation is one that you have to sort of think outside of the box. But another potential explanation for the Bermuda Triangle is that actually there isn't any increased rate of accidents or missing vessels in the Bermuda Triangle. That's another potential explanation, which is that there's actually nothing about the Bermuda Triangle at all. It's just this sort of, this sort of urban legend that has been embellished and accelerated, from people to people. So what is the best likely explanation for why the situation is what it is? And then we get very creative. And if you look, let's say back in the day, we had a lot of explanations that we would now basically laugh at. And we have our own sort of prevailing explanations for a lot of things. We have our own prevailing theories. Any theory, that's what Karl Popper is going to say, no matter how good your explanation is, no matter how good your theory is, it is always subject to revision. And maybe, in 100 years from now, or even sooner, people are going to look back at some of the explanations that we had for a bunch of different phenomena, and they're going to think that some of our explanations were pretty bogus. But for instance, now, let's say in psychology, we have a prevailing paradigm of understanding what they would previously call, demons and demonic possessions and exorcisms. We now have a paradigm which speaks of sort of mental illness, which is understood neurologically and genetically and chemically. But back in the day, the explanation for why people would, claim to hear voices or believe that they were the reincarnation of Jesus or something like that, but it was because this derangement was as a result of some ghosts or some spirits, some demonic possessions. And then we had all these, an explanation that was put forth, an explanation that would also give rise to a certain methodology that if you want to get rid of the spirits, the best way to do it is to, drill a hole into a person's skull, and then you're going to ventilate the brain, and then the spirits, have a way of getting out. Or if you're diseased or you're sick, one way to alleviate this disease is to let the disease is going to run out if you let out some blood. So things that we have now sort of disproven, but at the time were regarded as quite serious, and they stood by their explanations at that time. There's another one, weapon salve, which I'm not going to get into, but this idea that the wound and the weapon which inflicted the wound have a sort of have a symbiotic relationship. They are now sort of intrinsically, sort of cosmically, quantumly entangled. The wound and the dagger which inflicts the wound are sort of entangled in a certain way. And then they sort of use this. They tried to develop some sort of means of communication with this. Okay, it wasn't very effective. Okay, so that's the first concept that I want you to retain: is inference is the best explanation. Given a situation, no matter how complex and how difficult and how crazy the situation might seem, the mind naturally gravitates towards generating different hypothetical explanations. And then we assess those hypothetical explanations based on how well they match for the evidence. But then those explanations are also testable and themselves verifiable. Okay. There's another example that I could have shown you. Is basically, there's some of you guys know these like magicians. Okay, we watched a little bit of James Randi, but another famous magician nowadays is David Blaine. And in one of his recent, I don't know, what is it, videos or whatever, he sticks basically looks like a very long, thin stainless steel needle right through his bicep. Okay, and then Ricky Gervais is pulling it out. So I encourage you to watch it. If you watch David, if you Google David Blaine and Ricky Gervais, it's pretty entertaining. So he sticks this, look, what appears to be him sticking this very thin metallic needle straight through his bicep, and then he asks Ricky Gervais to slowly pull it out. And Ricky Gervais is engaged in this process. What's going on here? How can we make sense of what's going on here? He says it doesn't make sense. Okay, either this is the best illusion that I've ever seen, and you have some sort of prosthetic over your bicep, or you're a maniac. And I still don't know. I still don't have a verified explanatory principle as to how he does it, okay, whether it's an illusion, whether it's real. But there are some things that need to be taken into consideration. For instance, when he sticks a needle through his arm, he's not bleeding. So that doesn't seem to fit in with what we already know. That seems to contradict everything that we know about, blood circulation, and there's something wrong there. So that should be a pretty significant piece of evidence. But now the next concept, and this is something that you also have to look forward to, you have to look out for in your analysis of conspiracy theories and pseudosciences, is ad hocs. Ad hocs are very characteristic, a very characteristic feature of pseudosciences and conspiracy theories. So again, I think that if you're able to detect an ad hoc during your presentation, and you're able to say, look, here is a very clear ad hoc. This is what they claim. When that claim gets challenged, this is how they modify the initial claim in order to pretend that they still know what they're talking about and that they're still right. So let's get into this, and I'll give you a few examples. What is an ad hoc explanation? Here I have a roll of duct tape. Okay, it's basically a bit of patchwork. Is your theory or your explanation encounters something which it cannot explain, it cannot account for, it encounters an anomaly, and instead of admitting that there's something wrong with the theory or that theoretical explanation, you basically just modify the theory so that you either ignore the anomaly or you sort of artificially compensate for it. It's an arbitrary modification of the theory to keep it basically alive and functional. That if you do a little bit of that, that's okay. All theories do a little bit of that. Even some of our best scientific theories do a little bit of that, because there are things which should be accounted for by that theory, which the theory actually doesn't account for well. All theories eventually come across some anomalies. If you do a little bit of ad hoc, that's fine, because you say, look, we otherwise have a very good theory. We're not going to reject this otherwise good theory because there is this little discrepancy or this little anomaly. But it does become problematic, and this is precisely what you get when you look at pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, is you start to get a number of ad hocs, and then ad hocs on top of ad hocs, and it becomes a little bit embarrassing, because your theory becomes just this whole, all these little add-ons and these little appendages. Your theory has a bunch of little band-aids and duct tape all over the place. You are sort of artificially keeping it alive. It's like the theory, instead of just admitting the theory is dead, it's finished. Okay, you sort of artificially resuscitate this thing. It becomes like a Frankenstein theory. It's like a monster. Okay, and what you should be doing is you should just put the theory out of its misery once and for all, instead of latching onto it and just keeping it, perpetually artificially resuscitating it. So you have that. I mean, you have this with a lot of conspiracy theories. Is when something challenges the conspiracy theory is simply modified. There's a few ways of doing that. One way of doing that is to just make the rabbit hole one layer deeper. Okay, add another layer of complexity, another layer of mystery. Say, well, okay, we've never seen these things. It's because there's always this sort of shadow government, whatever. Another thing is, let's say if you have any conspiracy theory which has a due date of some sort of future prediction, whether it's an end of the world prediction, or whether it's like Donald Trump is actually president, what you notice is that we arrive at the date which is predicted, and when the end of the world does not occur, or when Donald Trump is not declared president, what you do is you double down on the conspiracy theories. You say, no, actually, because of this arbitrary reason and this arbitrary reason, it's actually, the world is not going to end in 1991. It's going to end in 2020. It's not 2020. It's 2000. It's 2000, then 2001, then 2011, then 2020, 2021. Okay, Donald Trump was supposed to be president by the end of January, and then it was February, and then mid-March he's supposed to be president again. And if apparently if you follow it, he was supposed to have been president basically once a month for the past 8 or 9 months, whatever it's been. That becomes a little bit embarrassing. That's the shifting of the goalpost. So it's like sometimes you see these cars driving on the road, and you see the guy's sort of rear view mirror is tied on with duct tape, or his bumper is hanging on with duct tape, or his muffler is hanging on with duct tape. And sometimes, sometimes I applaud them and say, very good use of duct tape, very, very proficient use of duct tape. Very good. I mean, you managed to patch it up. Good for you. But then you see these people that are driving on the road, and their car is more duct tape than actual car. And that's when it becomes problematic. Okay. That's when it's like, at one point, it's almost like you're spending more money on duct tape than you're actually spending on either actually the genuine repairs. But you can imagine like a car that is so bad that you're actually spending more money on duct tape than what it would cost you to actually finance or buy a new car. Okay. So we're using this analogy with regards to a theory. The theory is so artificially sustained that it's an abomination of nature. Okay. You might as well just take it in the back and put it out of its misery. But for some reason, we latch onto those theories. So that is an ad hoc explanation. An ad hoc explanation in science and philosophy is a hypothesis that is added to a theory in order to save it from being disproven or falsified. An ad hoc hypothesis is compensating for anomalies. An ad hoc hypothesis is compensated for anomalies not anticipated by the theory in its unmodified form. So it requires these arbitrary modifications. So it's basically the duct tape approach. Okay. And the point is this. The point is any explanation, no matter how crazy or bizarre or unlikely, or no matter how disproven it has already been, if you add enough complexity to it, or artificial complexity to it, you can always keep the theory as being, well, it's possible. It's possible, now it's like rendered like highly, highly, highly unlikely, but you can always make a theory, no matter how crazy it is and how much evidence there is against it. You can always make the case that by making it even crazier, well, it's still possible. It's still possible. So for instance, this is a conspiracy theory that really sort of bothers me, was, I don't think anybody's presenting on it in this class, but it was basically the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory. Sandy Hook was basically a school shooting where this guy went into an elementary school and like walked into a classroom, and he ended up like many children died, like elementary school children. So it was like a massive tragedy in the United States. And Alex Jones, so probably many of you are familiar with that name. Alex Jones is a very famous promoter of conspiracy theory. He basically proposed that actually, no, Sandy Hook didn't happen. Well, you say, well, what about the kids? No, the kids were made up. Well, what about the parents that we saw, on TV crying? They're CIA actors. Okay, so that's sort of ad hoc number one. What about the police that were on the scene? Oh, they're CIA actors too. What about the fire? What about paramedics and firefighters? They're CIA actors too. What about the people that had to clean up all the blood that was on the floor? They're also CIA actors. And then he says basically, all your questioning about this leads me to believe that you, through your questioning, you're also part of the CIA. So and that's how, like, I've seen actually Sidney Powell, who is one of these ladies who is defending the claims that Donald Trump actually won the election and that she has all the evidence for it. She was being interviewed by an Australian journalist. And the Australian journalist said, you've made many claims about Smartmatic and all of these other electoral logistical counting machines. And then she basically stops and she asks the interviewer, do you work for Smartmatic? So I mean, you could just keep making the conspiracy theory as crazy as you want, and in doing so, you make it nonetheless, yeah, likely to be true, but ever increasingly unlikely to be so. So I have Red Green here. You guys don't know Red Green because you guys are a bit young, but this was a sort of a comedy show, a Canadian sort of a parody of a handyman show. And one of the running jokes was Red Green would fix everything with duct tape. Okay. And the point is that it would work no matter how no matter how artificially you resurrect this thing, it'll work. So at one point, let's say they cut a car in half and they tie it all back together with duct tape, and the thing works. In one episode, he makes a canoe entirely out of duct tape, and it works. But the point is, it's ridiculous. Okay. So scientists are often skeptical of theories that rely on frequent, again, as I said, the occasional use of an ad hoc is sort of permissible because you say we otherwise have a pretty good theory. Scientists are skeptical. So again, what I'm asking you to do is keep your eyes open for anything that looks like an ad hoc with regards to your presentations. And we also saw this when the bit of the documentary watched last class with James Randi, Secrets of the Psychics. We have this ad hoc in the form of, you have Uri Geller, and all of a sudden he has a bunch of props that he himself has not been able to manipulate on the Johnny Carson show. And he comes up with a convenient excuse. The convenient excuse is, your skepticism is overpowering my psychic ability. So I don't feel strong right now. My psychic abilities are being blocked as a result of your attempt to test me. That might be true, but it's also very, very convenient for him. Okay. And to the point where it gets a little bit too convenient that the whole explanation becomes sort of embarrassing. It's like, okay, no, just drop the act. Okay. But I mean, it still might be true. Scientists are often skeptical of theories that rely on frequent unsustained adjustments to sustain them. This is because if a theorist so chooses, as I just said, there is no limit to the number of ad hoc hypotheses they could add. You could just keep making it more and more complex. This often comes at the cost of the theory's predictive power, and this is the point that I want to make. Ad hoc hypotheses are often, as I said, characteristic of pseudoscientific and conspiratorial ideas and theories. It's sort of like if you have a friend who's her boyfriend just broke up with her, and she says, "Oh well, he broke up with me because he's trying to send me a message. He's kind of playing hard to get. He wants to see if I'm going to come back to him." Okay, that's interesting. It's a little bit crazy, but it's possible. And they say, yeah, but now he's dating this other girl. Oh yeah, but he's dating her because he knows that I don't like her, so he's still sending me a message. He's trying to make me jealous. That's a little bit weird, okay? But now they're getting married. Oh well, did you see the ring that he got her? That's the ring that I actually showed him. So he's still sending me messages. He's still basically playing hard to get. Yeah, that's pretty messed up. So yeah, okay, but now they're having a kid. Oh yeah, but they're naming their kid Linda, and that's the name that I always liked, and I always told them that I would name my kid that. So at one point you have to say, listen, you're a little bit messed up. You probably need some help. You need to change your underlying ideas here. So this is one of the famous examples of an ad hoc is the comparison between two models. Okay, the Earth-centered model and the Sun-centered model. This is the geocentric model that we get from Ptolemy and Aristotle, and this is the heliocentric model that we get from Copernicus and Galileo. And the point is, this model will actually work. The geocentric model with the Earth at the middle will actually work if you add a bunch of duct tape on it. It'll help you not explain. It's not helping you explain anything, but it'll help you describe the night sky. It'll help you know, when the eclipses are going to happen, and the lunar eclipse, solar eclipse is going to help you know. You can describe the motions of the planets and know when which planet is going to be where. But what this requires is this sort of duct tape in the form of what they call epicycles. So according to this model, everything goes around the sun in a perfect everything goes around the Earth in a perfect circle, because there's something sort of mystical about the circle. Everything has to go around in a perfect circle. Actually, we know that planets don't do that. They go around in sort of this parabolic, this parallax of an elliptical, around the sun. And I have a point to make about that as well. But if you're going to have the planets go around the Earth in a circle, what you need in order to actually have a minimally adequate system, a descriptive system, is you need to have what is called an epicycle on top of that cycle. So on top of the cycle, you need to have this other little wheel, which has no basis in anything whatsoever. There's no reason for why it should do that. Okay, so let's say if you're tracking the movement of Mars, you have this sort of retrograde motion. Mars looks like it's going linearly around the Earth, and then it slows down, and you say, well, what the hell's going on? And it starts to back up. You say, what's going on here? And then it slows down again, and then it continues. There's no reason to, there's no way to explain for that motion if you believe that everything is going around in a circle. So the only way to account for it is with this arbitrary addition of what is called an epicycle, so that while Mars is going around, it does little pirouettes. Okay, but again, it's completely, there's no. But we say no, you just don't talk about it. We don't talk about the epicycles. We just sort of accepted it. We're happy that it works, and we don't talk about it. But the point is that it's a sort of a weird problem because there's no basis for it whatsoever. But then when you switch from the geocentric model to the heliocentric model with the sun at the center, everything now fits. And it's much more elegant in the sense that you do not need this additional arbitrary baggage of epicycles. The planets do exactly what they're supposed to be doing without this loop on top of a loop. Okay, that's actually what astrology does. Astrology basically is like, well, if your horoscope is not accurate enough, then just add another level to the horoscope. So it's not just your horoscope, then you talk about your moon sign, and then your Venus was here, and then your Saturn was over there. So you render it sufficiently complex that it appears to be valid. But what you've done is just keep adding loop on top of a loop on top of a loop. So this, not only is this model, the heliocentric model, more simple, it's much cleaner, it's much more elegant. And furthermore, and this is also very important, is once we develop the telescope and you start noticing the other solar systems, the new model that you have, which is the heliocentric model, is in some sense you can extrapolate from what we know about our solar system onto other solar systems. Whereas this model cannot be extrapolated onto anything else other than what's going on here. Actually, it's even deeper than that, is the idea that there are any other solar systems. It actually contradicts the basic assumption of this theory altogether. So there's a fundamental contradiction there, that you have completely different systems that have nothing to do with planet Earth. Yeah, the Earth is no longer the center of existence. So there's even a much more profound contradiction. Any questions or concerns about anything at this point? Yes, no, maybe. Let me see something in the chat here. I'm missing. All good, thank you. So let's proceed here. So keep in mind, let's say, a fair question would be, how would you define an ad hoc, and what would be some examples of it? Another thing that we need to consider, and now we're getting into, let's say, the third category here, the third main concept that I want to cover, and there's quite a few little bits with regards to this one, is how do we assess a theory as a whole? How do we assess a theoretical explanation? How do we assess a hypothesis? How do we assess a theory as a whole? And how can we decide between competing ideas or explanations? So one thing that a theory has to do, it has to be consistent. And there's two ways of understanding consistency. One way of understanding consistency is in terms of what you would call internal consistency. That is to say, it is free of contradictions. And I'll give you some examples of that. And the other one would be external consistency, is the world simply has to match, your theory has to account for and match the data, okay? For instance, I think I gave you the example last class when we were talking about definitions of pseudosciences of, let's say, scientific racism and phrenology and all this stuff. This idea, for instance, that given adequate access to education, people of different races and ethnicities can be just as good as, let's say, white people in terms of mathematics and science and so on. That might not fit with your idea if you adhere to scientific racism, but then you're just not accepting, let's say, real world data anymore. You are deliberately excluding. Your ideas are no longer consistent with observable data. So there's something wrong there, okay? Like, say, if you have, I believe I used this example in a previous class. If you have this idea that prohibiting abortions is actually going to save more lives in terms of, having children be born, your idea is simply not matching the facts, is not taking into account the reality of the situation in terms of, let's say, back alley abortions and all this stuff. So there are many ways in which your theory does not account for the actual data that it's supposed to. So it's a pretty bad theory. Okay. There's a deep problem. If the theory is there to account for the data and it's not accounting for the actual observable data, then there's a problem. So like a simple example would be if you it's a summer day, it's a hot summer day without a cloud in the sky, and you observe that your car is wet in the driveway, but everything else in the whole neighborhood and in the whole vicinity appears to be bone dry. And if you say my car is wet because it rained, that seems to be externally inconsistent with the observable data, which is everything else is dry. So you need to come up with a better explanation than the rain hypothesis for why your car is wet. You need to maybe say, maybe some neighbors threw a water, maybe the neighbors threw a water balloon on my car. Okay, they're up to mischief again. Or maybe, your father decided to wash your car because he was embarrassed by how dirty it was. That seems to be a better explanation in terms of inference of the best explanation than the idea that there was a sort of a storm cloud that just had a specific vengeance just for your car and your car alone. Internal consistency is, does the theory contradict itself? And now here we're talking specifically about, let's say, scientific theories, but let me try to give you, let's say, a general sense of this. These would be non-scientific theories, but let's say if you believe in reincarnation and you believe that everybody is the reincarnation of everybody else, that seems to be internally inconsistent, because the rate at which people are born at is not exactly the same rate at which people die at. So there's just an accounting problem of souls. There's a sort of a deficit or an excess of souls. That would be a sort of contradiction. If you say, this is some of the contradictions that the medieval philosophers would be dealing with, was, how do we understand that we are free and yet God is all-knowing? That appears to be a contradiction. But here we're looking at, let's say, contradictions within scientific theories. So again, let's say scientific racism might say, the white race is smarter because proportionally speaking, their cranium is larger than any other race. But then you say, well, actually, maybe this might be external consistency. Let me just finish the example. I already gave you this example actually in another class. The white people's heads are bigger than other races, but then you say, well, women's heads are bigger than men's heads by proportion, and you say, okay, no, never mind. Retract because it's no longer it no longer plays into sort of our agenda or our ideology. Let me give you this example of internal consistency. Two examples of internal inconsistency that Galileo found in Aristotle's physics. One example is the famous idea that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. That seems to be completely intuitive. It seems to be almost common sense, and yet we've been told that it's false, and we believe that it's false. So that is to say, if I have an object, if I have two balls, one is made out of lead and the other ball is made out of cork wood, and they're the same volume and the same size, that is to say they're going to meet with the same air resistance, and I drop them off the top of a high building, they're going to hit the ground at the same time, which is counterintuitive. Okay, and it's fascinating. But Galileo contradicted this. He said there's a contradiction. He says, I don't even need to go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower to actually demonstrate this. I could just demonstrate that the idea is contradictory. It predicts two different things. And I might send you a video of what's his name now? His name eludes me. But he gives basically a proof of this, why it must necessarily be false. Edward de Bono gives a kind of a breakdown of this. And it basically consists of this. If I have a light object and a heavy object, the heavy object is supposed to fall faster than the lighter object. But what if I attach the lighter object to the heavy object? Now, in some sense, it predicts two different things. In one prediction is that it will actually make the heavier object slower. And another prediction is that it should make the heavier object faster. So the same theory predicts two different things. So there's something fundamentally wrong with it. So Galileo corrects that, and he says, objects fall at the same speed regardless of their mass. The altering factor of their speed is not their mass, but their shape. That is to say, their wind resistance is actually the determining factor. So there's that Galileo saw as an internal inconsistency. There's another example about Aristotle had this idea that everything moves, has something which is acting upon it as a force. That is also fairly intuitive, because most things that you observe moving, whether they're bicycles or cars or even you as you walk, they move, and there's always a sort of a perpetual force being acted upon it, whether it's, you know, your legs moving you forward, or gravity, which is, you know, making you lean forward. There's always a force there, except for projectiles. Projectiles, Aristotle's physics has difficulty accounting for the projectiles, because where is the force that's acting upon it? You know, once the bullet leaves the gun or the arrow leaves the bow, there's no longer the bowstring exerting a force on it, and yet it continues. So Aristotle had this sort of strange explanation that there's basically this aerial vortex which is created, which circles back, generated by the object itself, which sort of generates a thrust, which is absurd, because then an unaerodynamic object should travel further than an aerodynamic object, which displaces less air. But yet an arrow will easily travel further than a rock, you know, thrown with the same force. So, and it's not creating this sort of, you know, self-generating thrust as a result of a self-generating little vortex. So that itself is in and of itself contradictory. Okay. Let's move on now to these criteria of adequacy. So you might have even come across this in high school here. So maybe this may sound new to you, or may it sound like a recap, but maybe we'll add some sort of fresh examples here. So there are 5 criteria by which we determine the adequacy of a theory, and how we even potentially determine how to choose between 2 competing theories. So let's go through each of these. And again, these I want you to retain and potentially be able to come with an example. Testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on testability. I think that's the most important one for our sake, which in other words, how do we determine whether this idea is true or false? Okay, how do we determine whether this claim, or whether this pseudoscience, or whether this medical claim, or this conspiracy theory, what is relevant in determining whether it's true or false? What kind of experiment can we conduct? What sorts of variables should we be looking at? What is relevant in the determination of whether this idea has any legitimacy or not? Because there are some things that you can say. This is a very important point. There are some things that you can say which can never be disproven. But just because you cannot disprove them, some people take the fact that they cannot be disproven as an indication that therefore the idea must have some intrinsic value or some truth, because it cannot be disproven. But it's actually quite the opposite. If something cannot be disproven, in some sense, it's not that it's truthful, it's that it's somehow meaningless. It doesn't have any real world implications that you can sort of look at to then conclude whether the idea is true or false. So if something cannot ultimately be determined to be true or false, it's not a very useful claim. So let's try to unpack that. That would be testability. Is there a way to determine if an idea or a claim or a theory is true or false? And how would we go about making that determination? What is relevant in establishing the truth or the falsity of this idea or this theory? So testability, fruitfulness. Fruitfulness is, does a theory explain or uncover something new? A theory which explains something new or uncovers a whole new set of phenomena that are themselves verifiable is somehow better than one that does not. Okay, it's giving us sort of a new perspective on a new set of things in the world. Scope, a theory which explains a diversity of phenomena is better than one that is limited, or a theory that is more accurate than another is better than one that is less accurate. Okay, a theory which explains more is better than one that explains less, for all intents and purposes, all else being equal. Simplicity, we've already touched upon simplicity a little bit. Okay, the idea that my tire is flat because of the broken beer bottle, which I also observe on the driveway, that is fairly simple. There aren't many assumptions there. We actually know that tires get flat because they get punctured by nails or by glass or whatever. And here, all the combinations seem to be there. It's not a very complex idea. It's actually pretty straightforward. the idea of the SunCentered model is simpler in the Earth-centered model because it requires less assumption. It requires, at the very least, no arbitrary ad hocs. Okay, so in other words, a theory that can explain the same thing as another theory without having to use any ad hocs seems to be better, seems to be stronger. I mean, it's not necessarily the case that it's stronger, but it seems to be a sort of an indication. And finally, conservatism. How well does a theory fit with what we regard as previously well-established scientific knowledge? It's very rare that a theory is going to be so good. It's very rare that a theory is so good in all of these first four variables that you completely discard conservatism. Most of what we know fits in quite well, is actually in continuity with what we already think we know. Okay, it would be try to, let's say, imagine learning something new or discovering something new, which would require you to eliminate or drastically rewrite everything that you think you already know. That seems to be unlikely. Most of what you actually learn, most of the things that you actually learn, seem to tie in to things that you already know. Okay, and that's pretty straightforward. Actually, we'll make a whole point of that a little bit later on this semester when we talk about Thomas Kuhn and how we sometimes he says we have a revolutionary theory that is so good, as I said, in the first four variables, but fails completely in conservatism, that you actually get rid of all your past knowledge. And you say, my past knowledge was basically rooted in false, bad assumptions. And that we said basically what Thomas Kuhn says, at that point, what you do is you end up rewriting the textbooks. The textbooks at that point become sort of obsolete. Just throw them in the garbage, burn them, because they're in some sense outdated. It's very difficult to make a textbook outdated. If a textbook is sort of the repertoire of the elementary ideas in a given field, for you to throw out a textbook means that the field has drastically progressed to the point where all of the old basic assumptions no longer hold. That's actually very rare to do that. Most science takes place within the scope of what we already know and what we already believe. Okay, so let's get in a little bit more to each of these, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on testability. So let's say testability. If you say, for instance, there are ghosts, but you can't see them, touch them, smell them, you can't interact with them, they have no impact on the world, they leave no trace, then can we test them to actually determine whether these ghosts actually exist or not? The answer is no. And so the point is that the claim that ghosts exist has no scientific utility, has no scientific value whatsoever. Basically saying like ghosts exist would be saying like God exists. It doesn't, not only does it not explain anything, but you can't even use that theory or that idea to explain, to make any meaningful predictions in the future. So in other words, if they do exist, who cares? That in some sense, you might as well not talk about them. Okay. Or that if you, this is another point, that if you keep insisting after the realization that you cannot test for ghosts, if you can keep insisting that ghosts exist, then what you have to conclude is that this person's insistence on the existence of ghosts is more of a sort of a dogmatic or religious claim rather than a scientifically meaningful claim, in the sense that it's going to help us describe, it's going to help us describe, explain, and predict anything. It actually does none of those. So it's not a scientific explanation. Okay. There's a few things I want to say here, and there's a few things I want to communicate that I think are important, but there has to be some measurable implication of the idea. If there is no measurable implication of the idea, and there's no way, let me try to, if there's no way for the theory to ever be wrong under any circumstance, then it's not a useful theory, and it's not a scientific theory. If there's no way to ever say that something is true or false, then it's sort of meaningless. I'll try to give you a better example of this. Let me see. It's called Karl Popper's examples, especially pseudoscience. Okay, you say whatever not pseudoscience, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis. I mean, I'm not sure how popular psychoanalysis nowadays, but psychoanalysis is very, very popular, okay, during the course of the 20th century. So this idea that what you are is a function of early childhood events that you are unconscious of, okay? And you say, if you're honest, it's because of this. If you're dishonest, it's because of this. In other words, I can always conveniently point to something. The psychoanalyst always has the right answer. He can never not explain why you are a certain way. And so if somebody always has the right answer, if somebody always claims to know what they're talking about, then either they figured it out and they have universal knowledge, or they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, and Karl Popper is going to say exactly that. If somebody always knows what they're talking about, if they always have something to say, if they always can account for everything, then either they have this universal knowledge and they have the best theory in the world, or they actually don't know what they're talking about and they're making it up as they go along. Okay, keep that. So he says, the psychoanalyst can never be wrong. You can never disprove that the person is honest because of this event. In other words, they can say whatever they want. And then if you challenge them, they can even explain your resistance to their theory by psychoanalysis. I understand why you don't believe in psychoanalysis through psychoanalysis. Okay, so it's a little bit too convenient. It is not clear how the theory can ever be wrong. There is no circumstances under which they would ever admit that they are wrong. So that's very shady. Okay, they are always able to, after the fact, tell a story about how any given phenomenon fits their theory perfectly. And this should start to ring a bell with, let's say, a conspiracy theory always does this. You always sort of rewire it to explain whatever happened, to give your theory actually further evidence. Like, they kicked Donald Trump off of Twitter. Therefore, there you go. That is further evidence of, fake news and the liberal bias against Republicans. Yeah, maybe. Or you just take any evidence against you as further justification for what you actually believe. And even more so, psychoanalysis can explain everything in the past, but it never makes any predictions about the future. So in other words, they can say, you are the way you are because of what happened in your past. But they're not able to say, there is no testable implication. So they're not able to say, this is what happened to you today as a 5-year-old. Therefore, this is what you're going to be in the future. They don't make those predictions because they know very well that when they do make those predictions, it's not going to work out well for them. Okay, so they do not make bold conjectures. It's always about the past. It's always, you are what you are because of what happened in the past. But if you're able to say that, you should be able to say, therefore, what's happening to you now should also dictate what's happening to this young person now should also dictate something necessary about who they are going to be in the future. But they never do that. They never make predictions. And when you actually verify the predictions that they actually do make, they don't do too well. So that's indication of a pseudoscience. Psychoanalysis does not make bold predictions, and consequently, there's no way to actually truly test their theory under sort of a scientific controlled trial. Let me try to put it this way. If you go see a real doctor with an illness, the doctor may know what's wrong with you, or the doctor may not know what's wrong with you. Okay, sometimes the doctor is perplexed. Say, I'm going to send you to go see a specialist, or I'm going to send you to go do these tests. We're going to try to figure it out. If you go see a fake doctor, the fake doctor is always going to know what's wrong with you. The fake doctor, is never going to admit, look, I don't know what's wrong with you. Because why would they? Because they don't know what they're talking about to begin with. So it's not like there's a system in place. They just make it up as they go along. So a fake doctor will always know exactly what's wrong with you. And they will always be in a position to diagnose you. And they'll always know exactly how to fix you. Okay. And now this is the point, is if I go in, like say to see a real doctor and I pretend I have a broken bone or whatever, that's a kind of a bad example, but I pretend I have some kind of condition. A real doctor can presumably rule that out. They can say, I think that you're just making it up. Whereas a fake doctor you can go in as a good actor and you can sort of exhibit all the symptoms, but have no actual measurable empirical consequences to what you're saying, but he's not going to be able to detect them. Okay. And then furthermore is a doctor can make predictions. Okay. He's like, okay, if you eat too much sugar, this can happen. If you don't have enough sugar and you have these conditions, this can happen. Whereas a fake doctor, again, for the same reason as a psychoanalyst does not make predictions because there's no system in place. Somebody who knows everything or claims to know everything is either the universal genius or most likely he knows nothing at all. People like this. I have a one of my good friends, his brother, is one of the types of people that is always willing to give everybody he sees life advice. He always knows exactly what to say and what to do in any given situation. And then what you realize is, you're talking about, actually, you don't know anything at all. People that are always willing to say that they know actually don't know. Knowledge is always limited in scope. So if your theory and your knowledge is unlimited, then it's more sort of religious than actual science. Okay. So another example is young Earth creationism. Whatever you present as evidence against young Earth creationists believe that the universe is 7,000 years old. Yeah, which is a pretty interesting idea. The whole universe is 7,000 years old. There was Adam and Eve, and then they add up all the people in the Bible, and you get about 5,000 years. And then they add 2,000 years since Jesus, and they say approximately 7,000 years old. It's very special. Okay, but if you say, well, what about dinosaur bones? God put that there to test your faith. What about, cave drawings? God put that there to test your faith. What about carbon dating? Oh, carbon dating is a hoax of the devil. What about the Grand Canyon, which has tens upon thousands of layers of strata that were deposited annually, year after year, during a specific period of the formation of the planet? God put that there to test your faith. So in other words, there's no evidence that you can ever present to the person, which is going to get them to refute their ideas. And furthermore, their theory does not help them explain anything. It's not like, oh, we've just discovered this new canyon. Therefore, we should expect to, they don't say anything. There's no future predictions. It's just with everything that we know, yeah, that's God's intention. But if you know what sort of God's intention was, maybe can you say something else? No, not really. And then you have basically the only prediction that is made is sort of Armageddon. And then, there's different groups that say Armageddon was supposed to happen, and then it doesn't happen, and it's supposed to happen, it doesn't happen, it was supposed to happen, it doesn't happen. But then when it does happen, they're going to say, look, we told you all along. And actually, there are some religious groups that actually want Armageddon. They would rather jeopardize, human civilization in order to give them a feeling of justification of the truth of their beliefs. In other words, they are acting in such a way to actually bring about the conditions of their apocalyptic worldview, which is pretty messed up. So let's look at that's testability. Was there another example of that? I think that's there has to be some prediction, some real world prediction that we can then say, if the test is done, it's true. If the test is not done, it's false. If there is no circumstance anywhere under which we can do that, then you're not dealing with a scientific theory. You're dealing with dogma or religion. Okay. So it's sort of like, a flat earther. You say, well, how are we going to go about testing whether the world is flat or whether the world is round? You say, well, NASA took some pictures and the world appears to be round. Well, NASA's in on it. They're part of the conspiracy theory. Oh, so now it's a pseudoscience which actually opens up as a conspiracy. It's a pseudoscience which opens up as a global conspiracy. But what about the Russian Space Agency? They have pictures too, and the world appears to be round. They're also in on it. What about Chinese Space Agency? They have their own pictures. Let me think about it. They're also in on it. Okay, so then you get, that's basically the ad hoc. You keep shifting the goalpost. You keep rendering the theory more and more complex, more and more layers of complexity. And by doing so, you can always avoid testability. Fruitfulness. A theory which explains something new is better than one that does not. So let me see what examples I have here. So Einstein's theory of relativity, specifically theory of general relativity, explains new phenomena which Isaac Newton's theory, classical mechanics, could not explain. Okay, let's say, let me try to give you an example of this. Isaac Newton's theories can explain the orbits of all the planets with a high degree of accuracy, except for, I believe, Mercury. There's something about Mercury which was an anomaly. Okay? Does that mean that you throw away Isaac Newton's physics? No. Okay, you just sort of account for it, or you say this is a problem and we're just gonna like leave it on the shelf for now. But it does a fantastic job at explaining everything else. And then you have Einstein's theory, which comes along. It's sort of like Newton's theory 2.0, because it does everything that Newton's theory does, plus it explains these sort of high energy, high velocity, high gravitation circumstances where things start to act a little bit funny. So what it actually is, it is able to predict and explain the position of Mercury. Because of its vicinity to the sun, there's an additional sort of a space-time curvature as a result of its proximity to the sun. So what you would expect Mercury to do according to Newton's model, based on its mass and its position relative to the sun and its velocity, is that it's supposed to do something like this, okay? It's supposed to have a sort of a parallax like this. But what it actually does is it actually goes like this, It actually does that a lot faster. And it has a much higher frequency of parallax in its revolutions around the sun. And that's because when it's in the vicinity of the sun, it takes on a little bit more speed. Another thing that Einstein's theory can predict is something that was theoretically implied, but never experimentally observed, which is a gravitational wave, which is, let's say, if a star blows up in a not too distant galaxy, the star that blows up actually sort of sends a shock wave through space. It actually sends a sort of a ripple through space-time. And that's actually measurable. Okay. That's something that that is a new phenomenon that ends up being an observable phenomenon, which is implied by the theory and ends up being observed, which Newton's theory would not be able to account for. Same thing with black holes. Okay. So in some sense, we are uncovering new elements of reality, a theory which enables you to uncover new elements of reality and explain new things, new phenomena, is better than one that does not. Okay. Scope. A theory which explains more is better than a theory that explains less. So for instance, this is kind of a silly and trivial example, but theory of evolution is, you'd say, suppose we would say theory of evolution and creationism are equal, but theory of evolution can explain why human beings have a tailbone, and creationists cannot explain for the life of them why God would have given Adam and Eve a tailbone. There's no way to explain it. Okay, evolutionary theory can explain it, so it seems to explain more. It accounts for more. Okay, another example would be, let me see. Back in the day, we had a theory of electricity and magnetism, and they were regarded as two different phenomena. There was theory of electricity and a theory of magnetism. And then there was, who was it? It was Faraday or Maxwell came and observed that these two laws were basically the reciprocals of each other. So, when you have, when you spin a magnet in a specific context, you create an electromagnetic field. You can create electricity. And if you run electricity in the right way, you create a magnetic field. So now that's in some sense more scope, because we have two theories that we are explaining simultaneously. We're explaining in some sense more. And there's also fruitfulness there, because not only are you explaining more, but you're also explaining now something new, which is the connection between those two things. And it's also simpler. It's simpler because it's more elegant. You can explain more with less equations. So it's cleaner in the sense that it's also more elegant and more simple, which is itself a different criteria. Another way to understand scope is, let's say, accuracy. A theory, or what I have here is not really, this is more of a kind of a study, but a theory which is more accurate, which gives more accurate predictions, is also a function of scope. Okay. So just consider this, okay? Let's say attempts to measure the speed of light. Galileo attempted to measure the speed of light with covered lanterns on the top of distant mountains, and it was inconclusive. Okay? Light was just too fast. He couldn't even get a sense of it. And then we have these progressively going throughout history over the course of the past few centuries, these greater and greater and more precise attempts to measure the speed of light until finally we observe the speed of light that we are very confident in saying is the exact speed of light, which is approximately 300,000 kilometers per second, which is inconceivably fast. Okay. Simplicity is criteria number 4. A theory which is simpler is better than one which is complex, especially when it's complex as a result of arbitrary luggage in the form of ad hocs, in the form of all that duct tape. Why is a simpler theory better? This seems to be a kind of there's something aesthetic about it. There's something about elegance, even in mathematics, there's this idea of a theory which is more elegant, which is more simple, is better. And in science, I presume one of the reasons for that is the less assumptions that you have, the less likely you are to be wrong. So a theory which makes less assumptions or requires less duct tape, requires less complexity to explain the same thing, everything else being equal, is a better theory. Okay. So again, the flat tire explained by the beer bottle is a simpler theory, much simpler theory than the flat tire explained by, extraterrestrial pranksters. There are a lot more assumptions in the second one than there are in the first one. The idea that the sun is at the center makes the whole system much more simple, much more elegant than putting the earth at the center. It's a much more simple theory. Okay. Maybe you can consider the difference between creationism and all the assumptions that are involved in creationism versus the assumptions that are involved in evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory doesn't have that many assumptions, and it actually explains quite a bit. Creationism has quite a few assumptions, okay, involving even, let's say, metaphysical assumptions and intelligent designers and, God and his psychology and the intention as to why he even created existence. So I don't know if you want to contrast those two things. Okay. And finally, conservatism, a theory that fits well with what we already regard as true and scientifically established is better. So again, this idea of David Blaine sneaking a needle through his arm and not bleeding, that seems to suggest that it's an illusion. Because if you stick a needle through your arm and you don't bleed, then that seems to be something that we cannot account for through our prevailing current understanding of biology and physiology. If you stick a needle straight through your arm and you don't bleed, then maybe there's something in biology textbooks that needs to be fundamentally rewritten. Or there's nothing wrong with biology textbooks, and this is just a fantastic illusion, which it may very well be. So as I said, generally speaking, a theory which fits what we already regard as truthful is a better theory, but it's not always true. For instance, in the case of Galileo and Copernicus, I already mentioned this, I'm restating it. This is a theory which completely violates conservatism. It completely destroys the astronomy textbooks up until that point. The astronomy textbooks after Galileo, everything before Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler and all these folks, all the astronomy textbooks before basically have to be destroyed because they are rendered obsolete. The theory is so transformative that it completely shatters the desire to hold on to any relics of the old theory, any remnants of the old theory. But that's a rare occurrence in science. So that's basically it. Okay, we'll talk about the Max Planck. That usually we do sort of stick to our old theories. We have a sort of we want to keep them alive, and that can become problematic because then we turn these old theories that encounter so many anomalies into these sort of Frankenstein monsters. We need to know when to put them out of their misery. But that's very, very difficult for some people to do, especially if you've been in the scientific field for decades, and now all of a sudden, you're asked to completely rethink or have a completely different perspective on what you regarded as, truthful knowledge up until that point. But that's basically it. So what I want you to retain is inference is the best explanation. What is an ad hoc hypothesis? And what are these criteria of adequacy, with some definitions and examples of all of those things.